Hello and welcome to the Smart Recovery Podcast, your audio headquarters for inspiring and insightful discussions on the topic of addiction recovery. What you'll hear with us will be self-empowering, science-based, and stigma-free. We believe you have the power within yourself to make changes that will move you toward a more satisfying life. And we hope these messages and interviews with leading addiction experts and advocates will help you believe that too. Remember that the purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. It is not a substitute for medical care from a doctor or other qualified medical professionals. Before making any changes in your treatment plan, please discuss your thoughts with your medical provider.
Welcome to the Smart Recovery Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Frazier. Today on the podcast is a conversation with Dr. Sarah Zemore, Senior Scientist and Center Associate Director at the Alcohol Research Group in Emeryville, California. She recently completed a national study on 12-step alternatives and recovery outcomes that indicated, spoiler alert, Smart Recovery participants obtained equivalent recovery benefits to those attending Alcoholics Anonymous, Women for Sobriety, and LifeRing Secular Recovery. For that and other important research on the psychological and social aspects of alcohol treatment and recovery, Dr. Zemore received the inaugural Smart Recovery Science Award in 2019 as part of SMART's 25th anniversary celebration. Dr. Zemore, congratulations on the award and welcome to the Smart Recovery Podcast.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted and honored to be here.
Okay, to start with, tell me a little bit more about the Alcohol Research Group. I guess you've been there for more than 15 years, and I was a little unsure how it related to the Public Health Institute. Can you just take me through it?
Yeah, so the Alcohol Research Group is a nonprofit institute that conducts mainly alcohol research. We have about 14 scientists, and it's a mix of disciplines, some public health folks, psychologists, and economists, sociologists, and we house a NAAA funded, that is the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. So it's an NAAA funded National Alcohol Research Center, which funds a lot of our work. And we also get grants from other grants, independent grants from NAAA, as well as some from NIDA, which is focuses on drug use and problems. So I guess that's a little rundown on ARG. We just celebrated our 60th birthday, so we've been around for a long time. And our parent institute is the Public Health Institute. So that's how we relate to those guys.
So with that Alcohol Research Group, you've had a number of different roles. Where did you start, and tell me a little bit about your position now?
Yeah, well, I started as a postdoc there, again, an NIAAA funded postdoc in 2002. And I was working with my mentor at the time, Leanne Kaskudis, and I was really interested in working with her partly because she was studying mutual health groups. She was studying AA at that time. That was one of her major research interests. And AA really was very fascinating to me. I came out of very mainstream social psychology, actually, although I knew something about clinical, and I understood that, the predominant model for treating alcohol problems was a more professional model, and this idea that going to a group that where you would talk to your peers about your problems with drinking or drugs and get help from them was fascinating to me. And I wanted to know if it was effective. So I started working with her, and one of the things that we did explore was the association between involvement in mutual health groups, and particularly 12-step groups like AA, and substance use outcomes among those who were in treatment for alcohol and drug problems, as well as in the general population. And so I did some work on that, and it just became more and more interested as I went, because I saw in study after study, not only in the analyses that I was doing, but also, in other people's work, that there was a strong and very consistent association between higher involvement and better outcomes, better recovery outcomes. And it was a large enough, a significant and reliable enough association to really get my notice. I mean, usually when you do research on human beings, the kind of associations that you could expect are pretty small, and things kind of come and go in the data. But this was a very large signal, and I thought it was really worth studying and understanding more about why these groups might be effective. So that's kind of how I started out. Did you want me to continue with my later work, or how I got interested in the alternatives?
I think it's certainly indicative when a researcher such as yourself, if you find something fascinating, if you find something that really, sparks your interest, then is it usual that you would follow along those lines and just kind of go deeper and deeper into it? And is that how you ended up discovering SMART?
Yeah, well, the reason I became interested in the alternatives was because I realized as much as powerful as 12-step groups could be, that they were extremely limited. And there were two things that really that I noticed, again, also very early on. And one of them was that people just had a hard time keeping up consistent involvement with 12-step groups. That even if they did get involved, and a lot of people just weren't interested at all, but even among those who did become involved, that they were likely to drop out and not maintain involvement. These groups were just not appealing to the majority of folks with substance use disorders. And and even when you encouraged them and did your best to get them to attend, and I'm thinking here of the work that's been done on 12-step facilitation. I don't know if you're familiar with that work, but there have been clinical trials designed to test whether you can get people to become involved in 12-step groups and stay involved via facilitating their involvement. So there are interventions called 12-step facilitation interventions that do that. And Project Match was a very large trial that tested a 12-step facilitation intervention and compared the results against cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational enhancement therapy. So with the latter two approaches being quite dominant, kind of standard approaches in the substance use field. And so they found that, indeed, folks who participated in the 12-step facilitation did as well or better than those who participated in the alternatives, again, cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational enhancement. And they did better, actually, in the outpatient arm. So they had higher odds of abstinence. So that, again, shows how effective participation in 12-step groups can be. But also they found that even at 6 months, the 6-month follow-up, the large majority of those in the TSF or the 12-step facilitation condition were not attending weekly. So something like 63% were not attending weekly. So even when, people became involved in this pretty intensive 12-session intervention designed to get them to become and stay involved in 12-step groups, it just wasn't successful. There were just, a majority of people were just not going to do that. And that's important because they didn't do as well. Those people, of course, who weren't involved were not doing as well at 6 months. So that's very so and that's typical even in these other trials that have attempted to facilitate involvement in 12-step groups have not been entirely successful in that sense. So that was the first thing that really made it very clear to me that we need to know more about alternatives to 12-step and facilitate involvement in those alternatives also if they're effective, because clearly, people found a lot of people found 12-step unappealing. So the other thing that really I became aware of was that, I guess I would say I became aware of was that mandating involvement in 12-step is unconstitutional. So the issue here is that, it's a quasi-religious organization, and so, it violates the Constitution to mandate involvement in 12-step, and yet a lot of people were and are getting mandated to treatment. But this is really just sort of like the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of people, even when they go voluntarily to treatment, 12-step is kind of all that's available. So you're effectively, forced to go to 12-step or to kind of use 12-step as part of your recovery if you seek treatment in public treatment programs.
Well, that's interesting because whether or not it's because the courts or whoever is mandating the 12-step participation knows anything about other alternatives, or just simply because it's always kind of been, okay, you have to go to AA and get your paper signed, and it's not really thought in any significant way to matter. I guess it just means you have to go somewhere, and so the court says go to AA. But and maybe not even thinking about some of the constitutional aspects, or the fact that if they're really trying to help someone and that someone does not want to participate in, as you say, a quasi-religious or some kind of spiritually based program, then it's like a shrug of the shoulders. And so is it really their responsibility to know more about, and do you think your research highlighting some other kinds of things will help courts or other institutions?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. I mean, I think that courts and treatment programs do have a responsibility to know more about the alternatives, and we as a scientific community have a responsibility to study the alternatives, because people should have choices, not only because, a lot of people are not becoming involved in 12 steps, so they're not getting the help they need, and because, yes, it's not ethical to present a religious alternative as the only alternative.
Yeah, well, I know that, and we can start talking about the study that was done and the year-long, 6 to 12 months, the follow-ups. I'll let you go through those details, but I will jump ahead and say that, as far as the aims of that study, I think you were talking about, or in the material I read, that the recovery of the individuals who are willing to use these tools, these approaches to dealing with their substance use disorder. And why wouldn't there be more mutual help groups that should be highlighted than just the 12 steps kind of program? So anyway, having said that, let's backtrack and just tell me, how did you decide to originally study SMART? And when you first designed this, how did it all fall into place?
Yeah, so I actually ran into Marty Nicholas, who is the founder of LifeRing, at a conference. And, so I became acquainted with LifeRing that way. And as I learned more about LifeRing, I became very interested in them. I mean, it is a secular alternative, and they have a focus on sort of cognitive behavioral approaches. And that was my initial sort of foray into understanding alternatives to 12-step. And I decided I wanted to study LifeRing. But as I got further along, I realized that there were other alternatives, not just LifeRing. And I became aware of SMART and Women for Sobriety also. So, and SMART, of course, was especially interesting because it's so, there are so many meetings, right? I mean, it's much more available than both LifeRing and Women for Sobriety. So I decided to try to do a study on all of these, so LifeRing, SMART, and Women for Sobriety, and tried a number of different grants. Actually, there wasn't a lot of interest initially, so I had to work really hard to get this line funded. I got a lot of critiques that, mainly people were saying, well, these alternatives are not very common. So, even if we found out they were effective, how's that going to help? People are not going to be able to access them. And, that just drove me crazy, because I felt like, you could say the same of any intervention, right? I mean, you could say the same thing about any new intervention. It doesn't exist yet. And yet you're going to test it with the idea that you would disseminate it if it was effective.
The veritable chicken egg scenario. I mean, if there's no options out there for people to try, then of course they're not going to grow and become more available.
Exactly.
Who finally listened to that reasonableness? You broke through someone's denial somewhere along the line, but and you said you had to work hard to do that. Are we talking a number of months or longer that you had to kind of keep tapping on?
No, it was years. It was years, and I had to, and really, I mean, the reviewers, I should say that, I improved my study design as time went on, and I was very green. So the reviewers had a lot of very good critiques, and I'm glad that I went through that process, because I did learn a lot, and the product that came out was much, much, much better. And it was it was very good. So finally, I got funded, and I was funded by NIAAA to do a comparative longitudinal study, observational study, which became the peer alternatives for addiction study, the PAL study.
Yeah, and that study itself was planned to be a year, and that's how long it took. Is that correct?
Yes, it did. So we implemented the baseline surveys in 2015 by coordinating with the directors of each of the 3 mutual health groups that we wanted to study. And then we also got a control or a comparison group of 12-step attendees by coordinating with In the Rooms, which is an online meeting hub for people in recovery that has a 12-step focus. So all of these organizations then helped us to publicize the study. In the Rooms had, it's an online group, so they had, banners about the study with our study webpage, and then the directors of the mutual health organizations sent flyers to meeting conveners who then passed those out. They also just emailed their email lists and talked about the study at meetings. And everyone was directed to our website, our study website, where they were screened for eligibility, and then if they were eligible, completed baseline surveys. So that's pretty much how it worked. And people were only eligible if they were adults, so 18 plus, and if they had a history of alcohol use disorder. So here we were really focusing on alcohol problems.
Yeah, I imagine that's a tough part of any study is just getting the group that you need together, the amount of people that fit the protocol or the definitions you're setting up.
Yeah, we were right, and we didn't know what kind of response we would get because this was a very sort of new sort of study, and but actually it was much easier to get respondents than we ever imagined. And we were in the field for 6 to 8 weeks, and that was it. And we got everybody that we needed. We got 647 cases, and it was amazing. And people were really excited to participate, actually.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that it's just because it's becoming more known that there are these, that a lot of us face these issues, that society-wide? Why do you think that was it was that way?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of people told me that they were grateful to participate and tell their stories, and that they felt very grateful for their mutual health groups, that they recovered through these groups, and they wanted the world to know about it, and so that other people could recover. So I think, there was a lot of interest in, I got the sense that people were very happy that there was finally some attention to alternatives to 12-step. And a lot of folks talked about, having negative experiences with 12-step, that, they were sort of told by 12-step members that this is the only way and that you'll die if you don't come back. And treatment programs sometimes focus too much on 12-step, and people felt really kind of coerced to go to 12-step. So I think people were relieved that there was attention to something else.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's not only then good timing on your part and your the alcohol research group, but also it answered a question that was out there, which was, hey, when are we going to get recognized? Or perhaps this is just a I guess I'm making, but the question was, when are we going to be allowed to tell our story? When are we going to be able to point out that this really works for us?
I had a sense that these alternatives could be as effective because my sense from just looking at the studies, looking at mechanisms behind why 12-step was effective, my sense was that the mechanisms were really more general. It wasn't about following the steps. It wasn't about completing the steps. It was about or reading the literature. It was about mainly the social stuff that happens where you form connections with other people in recovery, and you change your social networks, and you get friends that are also in the group and are following a recovery lifestyle, and that seemed to be very powerful. So yeah.
Yeah, and that isn't unique to. AA has certain literature, the big book, and others have, and even Smart Recovery has their 4-point program and those kinds of things. But it isn't so much the actual words on a page or the kind of thing you're doing to. It's the person thing. It's the mutual support.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's not to say that strategies don't matter, or that you shouldn't be sort of trying something concrete in your recovery, but I think that can take a variety of forms. That for different people, different things might work, and so when you get together in a room talking about what's working for you, then it's sort of like going to a university for recovery. Like, you can sort of think about how these things might apply to you, and try things that appeal to you. And so it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all strategy, but there are options there, both in the literature and that get presented via the relationships that you form. And actually your strategies may change as you get further along in recovery. So, yeah.
Yeah, those are both very good points. That while there may not be specific things that you have to look at and worksheets or whatever in one mutual support group, in others, those are the exact tools that work for you. I mean, yeah, and that's where it can be dangerous when we were talking earlier about this idea of if courts don't know about these things, or if others, if treatment centers are saying, well, we're AA based and that's that, then a lot of people can just are already not able to get what they need.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think one of the problems is that people may avoid treatment because they feel like, they're just going to get 12-step, and 12-step doesn't work for them if they go to treatment. So people can avoid getting help.
That's great. We're talking with Dr. Sarah Zemore, Senior Scientist, Center Associate Director at the Alcohol Research Group in Emeryville, California. She recently completed a national study on 12-step alternatives and recovery outcomes that indicated that SMART recovery participants obtained equivalent recovery benefits to those attending Alcoholics Anonymous, Women for Sobriety, and LifeRing secular recovery. Dr. Zemore, this is really fascinating, and now I want to get a little bit into the actual goals, if you will, or maybe in research parlance, it's the aims of the study. You identified different aims for this study, and what were they as far as like a primary aim or a secondary aim?
Right. Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think our overarching aim was to really see whether you got the same bang for your buck in each of these programs. So, if you became involved in SMART, LifeRing, or Women for Sobriety, did you do as well as if you became involved in 12-step? And that was really sort of the overarching question that we felt we had to answer as best we could, because that's what the field wanted to know, right? That's what clinicians need to know, treatment programs need to know, and lay people need to know as they navigate their decisions around these groups. And so, but we were also interested in some more basic epidemiological kind of questions, like what are the memberships like of these different groups, and that would help us understand what kind of populations these groups were appealing to. So that does relate to this kind of dissemination question of how can you get these groups out to people. So so those were the basic aims. And I mean, we were also interested in sort of involvement patterns over time. So how involved were people in each of these different groups, and then how likely were they to drop out? Were you more likely to drop out from 12-step or less likely compared to the alternatives, for example?
Yeah, it's just getting at, what works, what doesn't. Are you going to get what you need from any of these mutual support groups? And if so, how can you stick with it? Because you started out by talking about, that you were finding people, or it's obvious that people end up dropping out from all these things. And if it's not known that there's something else to try now that you left 12-step, then you can be kind of just box yourself in a corner.
Yes.
Moving on with the study itself, I think that you did follow-ups at 6 and 12 months after a first survey. What's that like in maybe just generally in research protocols? Is it interesting to you? Do you get excited at 5.5 months knowing that you're going to reach back out in a couple of weeks?
I mean, the whole process of data collection is very exciting. You know, I have done a number of types of studies where, you know, it's secondary analysis where I analyze pre-existing data, and, you know, that just holds. There's just no comparison with actually collecting your own data, because you can really ask the questions that you want to ask, that you feel like are really the most important questions. And yeah, I mean, I was really excited about this because I felt like I don't know, like I actually, at that time that I was doing this work, there was very little work, and I think there remains little work on continuing care. So what happens after people get out of treatment? We have this sort of short burst of treatment, and most of the studies focus on what happens there, right? When you go to outpatient program or residential program. But then after that, people have to maintain the recoveries, and we know sort of very little about how people do that, and there aren't a lot of resources for that. So I felt like mutual health groups could be very powerful in sustaining gains that people make in treatment, and also in offering some support for people that weren't ever going to go to treatment. And treatment is not necessarily accessible or appealing to everybody. So I thought this is really, really important, and it's addressing a need that most research does not, and most resources do not address. So I was excited.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I can hear it in your voice, and realize when you find something that just hasn't been looked at in any meaningful way, that really it should be. I mean, there's a kind of a should be there, because it's about helping people. It's about helping those that are struggling with various aspects of their lives. And yeah, I can imagine you got a little bit giddy when you saw that there wasn't many studies out there.
Yeah, I mean, I just was very surprised. Well, you know, I mean, it's an interesting kind of, there was an interesting progression in I think, interest in mutual health groups. The people that first started working on 12-step, I think, had a real battle to fight, because there was a lot of, and there continues to be a lot of skepticism around whether groups like AA could be effective, and people had a hard time getting their work, I think, out there. But that battle was then fought, so I think it paved the way for me to do my work. And it really almost had to happen that way, I think, that 12-step groups were studied first and then the alternatives, because it's just such a non-traditional, I mean, it's not within the framework of mainstream psychology. These groups are really outside of that. Yeah.
Even in a social psychology setting, I mean, it's I can see where it would be something that initially would be, well, we don't really need to have to look at that, or there's no reason to look at it. It's kind of over there and doing what it does, but wouldn't fit it. Yeah, well, that's interesting. And also, you know, the fact of sequencing, like you said, can you say a little bit more about that? Why would AA have to have been studied first before you got into the alternatives?
Well, I mean, I think, I guess you'd see it either way. I mean, AA, there was a good argument for studying AA because it was already so interwoven with the treatment industry. And, you know, like the vast majority of public treatment programs incorporate 12-step principles and, you know, 12-step members into their staff. And so there's a focus. I mean, I've been to treatment programs where they have the 12 steps on the wall, and you know, it's very, there's this interweaving that makes it almost, I guess, irresponsible not to study 12-step. And it's also, I mean, the meetings are so, there are just so many meetings all over the country, and actually all over the world. So it's very available. So it's an obvious question: is this really effective or not? And who is AA effective for? So, you know, I think, despite the fact that it's sort of a non-traditional approach or non-professional approach to recovery, then there's a really good argument for studying 12-step. And then once you know that 12-step can work, I think it paves the way for studying the alternatives, I guess is what I'm saying, because then, you know, people have already bought into the idea that mutual health groups can be effective. And so why not study the alternatives also?
Sure. I see that. And, here in Ohio, SMART is actually getting involved with talking to the courts, so the Ohio Supreme Court, about, the constitutionality. We touched on that earlier, and making sure that SMART is put in there as an alternative, because not just because we want to be, as prominent, or maybe not even because of that at all. It's that people will be helped because they will respond to the kinds of tools and the perspective and the kinds of activities that they can get at a SMART meeting that they wouldn't get elsewhere.
Right. Exactly. It's a very different kind of thing, and I think it's important for people to have have a choice, because different things will work for different people. And in fact, I mean, they do. Actually, some people go to both 12-step and SMART, and it's a fairly sizable proportion of people that do that. So you may get different. The same person may get different things from the two groups.
Right. That's a very good point. So if we were to bottom line it, and you're at a nice little get together there on the beach in California, and someone says, "Oh, Dr. Zemore, what have you been up to? How have you been doing? What's your work like these days?" You would say, "Well, I just finished a study on smart recovery, and here's what I found." How would you put a couple of sentences like that together?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would say that you get the same bang for your buck when you go to SMART and LifeRing and Women for Sobriety as you do when you go to Alcoholics Anonymous or another 12-step groups. So if you get involved at the same level, then you get the same benefits. You get the same improvements in your substance use problems, your alcohol problems in particular. So, yeah. So that's what I would say. And we know that because we measured people's involvement over time, and we measured their substance use over time. So, and we looked at how those move together. So, I don't know if I should say a little bit about how we looked at involvement, but it was basically this, it's like a little scale that looked at people's meeting attendance, whether they had a regular group that they went to, where they knew a lot of the people, whether they had a friend in the group whose number they had and who they could call on for help, whether they had led a meeting in the past 30 days, and whether they had done volunteer work in the past 30 days for the mutual health group. So we added all that up basically, and then looked at how that scores on that little measure related to their substance use outcomes. And so we found that for 12-step, the higher people's scores were on that little measure, the better their outcomes, and it was a strong and significant relationship. But the same thing was true for SMART, LifeRing, and Women for Sobriety. So if you got involved in those ways, you benefited, and that was great, because we were so happy to see that, because the more options people have, the better, and this means that clinicians can then refer people to these alternatives and expect that they'll do it as well.
That's fantastic. And when you say we were happy to see that, I mean, as a researcher, you're letting the data speak for itself, but as a human being, you're hoping that the thing you're studying has a positive impact on people. What is there a danger there that you're certainly not biased because you're reading the data, but talk a little bit more about why it would make you happy or satisfied.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess the reality is that usually as a researcher, you study things that you think will work. I mean, if you didn't think something was effective, you probably wouldn't study it unless, because your goal is to help people. So you want to identify interventions that are helpful. Unless maybe there was some case where you thought there was something was harmful and people didn't know about it, and you needed to demonstrate that. But so my goal here with this work is to help people. So, either way, I guess you could say, the research would be helpful to people, because if we had found the opposite, that you don't get the same bang for your buck at the alternatives, then that would suggest referring people only to 12-step, and that might help people that otherwise would be wasting their time or not getting the help they need. So, but I think. But I was happy to see it because, it just resonates with what people are saying about wanting choice, and I think there's something wonderful about being able to say, all of these things work, and it's about, connecting with. It seems to be more about connecting with others in recovery than the specific philosophical framework, and that suggests that, actually, if that's true, then mutual help groups of many types could be effective, and that just opens things up. The entire landscape doesn't have to be dominated by a 12-step, and that's a good thing too, because again, people, however effective 12-step is, many people don't like it, and so when you have effective alternatives, it's a great thing.
And it is a great thing, and your research has been a great thing. I think that it's obvious that you have that desire to help people. That Alcohol Research Group, because of the kind of work they do, is really trying to help, help people who are struggling with some substance use disorders to navigate their way through, you might say, the power of choice. And the power of choice, as Smart Recovery points out, is such an important thing for so many people, to not feel like they're being told what to do or told how to do it. That's Dr. Sarah Zemore. She is a senior scientist and the Center Associate Director of the Alcohol Research Group in Emeryville, California. Been a fascinating conversation. Anything you'd like to leave us with, Dr. Zemore?
Well, just to let you know, if you didn't know already, that I am interested in continuing this line, and have a grant under consideration now that would add to the sample that we already have from the PAL study, so that we could understand more about how each of the different mutual help groups that we studied works, and understand more about dropout over time, so that we can really help people to better understand how to utilize these groups, and also to facilitate involvement. And so that's kind of on the radar, and I'm hopeful that we'll get that funded. We're also interested in understanding how mutual help alternatives work for people with drug problems. And I have a grant under review that would look at that if it was funded. So there are a couple areas that we're working on, and just there should be hopefully more to come.
Good. Oh, that's great. And I'm sure we'll be, if we have any information that we need to share with our audience and share with the Smart Recovery community through our website and other means, we'll certainly do that. So if those get funded and move forward, then we might be able to point people in your direction.
Sounds great. Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Zemore. She's a senior scientist and the Center Associate Director of the Alcohol Research Group in Emeryville, California. Thanks so much for joining us and shedding such fantastic light on mutual self-help groups.
Great. Okay. I really appreciate the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the Smart Recovery Podcast. If you found today's episode helpful and inspiring, we encourage you to share it with someone who might need to hear its messages. If you or someone you know needs addiction-related help, we encourage you to visit smartrecovery.org to find a wealth of digital resources, practical tools, and social supports meant to help you and your loved ones on their recovery journey. While there, you can search for a local SMART meeting near you, or join our online community to find 24/7 access to recovery help through regular online meetings and helpful message boards and forums. All of our meetings and online community resources are completely free of charge. Be sure to connect with us online to get more helpful addiction-related resources. Visit our website at smartrecovery.org, where you can search for local meetings, join our online community, subscribe to our e-newsletter, and find regular blogs, videos, podcasts, and more. You can also help us to spread our self-empowering, science-based messages to more people who need to hear from them in important ways. First, get trained on the Smart Recovery Program. If you are a licensed healthcare provider and could benefit from using Smart Recovery in your professional work, or if you are someone who would like to volunteer and lead Smart Recovery meetings in your community, please check out our training and volunteer opportunities at www.smartrecovery.org/training. Second, donate to support our work. Smart Recovery is a nonprofit that runs on the donations from generous supporters who understand the need for recovery-related support. If you would like to help us reach more people, consider donating to Smart Recovery at smartrecovery.org/donate. We'd like to thank US World Meds for their generous support of this episode. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Smart Recovery Podcast.